Chapter 9. End of Caribbean Cruise. Getting back to the U-505, 2 kills in rapid succession started visions of sugar plums dancing in all heads again. They now had 6 sinkings totaling 40,300 tons. 2 more, or of similar size, would put them over the 50,000 mark. When low, an Iron Cross First Class, and give Iron Cross Second Class to many of the crew. With 6 more weeks to prowl in an area where ships didn't even zigzag, this should be a cinch. If they could economize on torpedoes by using their deck guns, as they had on the McKean, it was even possible they might stretch their tonnage close to 100,000. Some peace-loving citizens will say that it must take a brutal and callous type of man to think simply in terms of statistics on tonnage sunk. When the lives of human beings are involved, this is a smug and mistaken way to look at it. All it takes is to make the indignant and peaceful citizen think the same way is to find himself placed in a similar set of circumstances from you and me. They were products of our Western civilization, whose destiny on this earth put them in a spot which demanded that rational human beings become ruthless about certain things. You can't conduct submarine warfare in a kindly, humane manner any more than you can blast a sleeping city off the map benevolently. We found that out in the Pacific, where American subs following the same ground rules as the Germans ruled up some impressive statistics. We don't change the character of our men overnight when war breaks out. We change our scoring system for what is good and bad. In accordance with long-established custom among civilized nations, and with full approval of courts, and churches and governments, certain rules of conduct are temporarily suspended in wartime. Acts which society usually calls by unpleasant names and punishes severely may become praiseworthy acts for the duration. Deeds for which a citizen might ordinarily be criticized and maybe even hung, are rewarded with medals. So far, the U-505 had sunk over 40,000 tons. In doing so, she had killed perhaps several dozen men and left about 300 more to make their way to land, if they could, in open boats and rafts. But that was incidental, merely one of those loose ends in the normal way that nations work out their differences. The duty of a U-boat crew was to sink ships. What happened to the little men who ran up on deck after the explosion, scrambled into boats and rowed away while their ships were sinking? That was a problem for the survivors to work out, with their destiny. When the U-boat crew got home from that cruise, if they did, they would be just as kind to their wives and children as they had been before. So after a second kill, the U-505 continued happily on her journey, looking forward to a busy time in a rich haul. But it didn't turn out that way. They spent the next month prowling the Caribbean, seeing nothing but airplanes apparently flown by dopey pilots who were just out for the ride. They crash-dived for planes 30 times, but only had bombs released at them once, and then not accurately. The contempt in which they held our planes at this time is clearly shown in their war diary. They seldom spent more than 1 hour out of 24 submerged, even though they were averaging 1 sighting per day. Our flyers in the Caribbean, when they happened to see a submarine, would scatter a few depth bombs around, note that the submarine had disappeared, and fly back to base grinning from ear to boast of their sinking. It was for this reason that we set up assessment boards in Washington and London to analyze all attacks on U-boats and decide which ones had damaged submarines and which ones had merely shaken up the fishes. The most hard-hearted and cynical bunch of skeptics that I had ever known sat on those boards. They wouldn't believe their own grandmother under oath unless she was able to produce oil samples, photographs of 30 identifiable Teutonic types in the water, and the skipper's pants. Like the umpire in a baseball game, their word was final. Their decisions often infuriated us who were fighting the Battle of the Atlantic, and left us weeping into our beer at the officers' club between cruises and muttering, "We was robbed." But at the end of the war, when we got into the German Navy archives, we found that they had been uncannily right most of the time. These board members had good reason for their skepticism, and they weren't necessarily calling you a liar when they reduced your claim of a sure kill to possibly minor damage. The very nature of anti-submarine warfare is such that the boys working at this trade will always firmly believe that they are doing better than they really are. When a surface ship drops depth charges on a submerged sub, the ocean reverberates with echoes of the explosions for a long time, and it is impossible to ping again for some minutes. Meantime, a skillful sub-skipper who was merely shaken up by your attack may give you the slip and get away. A depth charge must explode very close to a submarine to crack the tough pressure hole, but any destroyer skipper who had a good solid sonar echo when he dropped his charges had all the dials on his attack director screaming fire at him, and who never got another echo off that sub is going to swear that he made a kill, especially if the sub ejected oil, garbage, and maybe an old pair of pants from its stern torpedo tubes right after the attack. Aviators have been held up to scorn as being flagrantly over-optimistic in their claims. In general, they were, but in anti-submarine warfare, there was much more excuse for it than in the bombing of surface targets where the Wild Blue Yonder boys claimed any bomb that landed in the outlying suburbs of a big city was a direct hit on the city hall. Whenever an airplane dropped a bomb within a half-mile of a surface submarine, the sub naturally pulled the plug and sank, forthwith, to a safe depth. When the flyer returned from that hop and swore that he had sunk the submarine, he was merely stating the facts truthfully as he had observed them. The assessment board had to sift the facts, with the above and many other things in mind, and determine whether the intrepid Birdman had really killed the sub or had merely frightened him into submerging. Photographs of 50 Germans clinging to bits of oil-soaked wreckage were the best evidence. Pictures of a salvo of depth charges exploding close aboard a sub on both sides were the next best. A huge oil streak that kept spurting hours after the attack was sometimes good enough. The noise heard by listening gear when a hull was being crushed by water pressure a minute or so after the attack carried a lot of water. Many U-boats went to the bottom in very deep water with all hands, leaving no evidence whatever behind until a day or so later when oil began to seep to the surface. The board had to score these attacks, as well as the ones in which the photograph showed the submarine with its stern end sticking straight up out of the water, and the crew plunging overboard. In both cases, the U-boat was dead, but in the first one, the evidence of death was inconclusive. At the end of the war, we found that the board's crystal ball had been a lot more accurate than any of us who were sinking the subs would believe it was when these chair-borne bureaucrats were rejecting claims that we knew were true. The board only allowed me 10 sure kills, although I still claim 11. During the next month, while Lowe ranged from one end of the Caribbean to the other, crossing and recrossing the regular traffic lanes, the yesterday, today, and tomorrow routine could have been even further simplified by eliminating yesterday. There was no use remembering yesterday, because luck was always bad, or rather, they had no luck, whatever good or bad. Tomorrow, of course, always promised to be better. Little incidents assume great importance at a time like this. One morning, there was a muffled explosion behind one of the diesels. The man on watch spun his throttle closed, and the chief engineer was soon squirming his way through the crates of canned provisions stored between the diesel and the pressure hole to find out what was ailing his engine. He finally traced the explosion to a case of canned frankfurters, which couldn't stand the tropic heat plus that of the diesel engine. This casualty placed a command decision squarely in the skipper's lap. Ordinarily, a U-boat would run out of food before she ran out of fuel. When preparing for a cruise, every nook and cranny of the boat was stuffed with provisions after she got her torpedoes and other war supplies aboard. Her stay in the operational area was planned on the basis that she had food for 90 days aboard. Napoleon said that an army travels on its belly. So does a U-boat. When a full case of frankfurters explodes, it upsets a lot of carefully laid logistic plans. Lowe's command decision was a clear-cut but touchy one, profoundly affecting every man in the boat. Should he eat up this case before it spoiled, feeding his boys nothing but frankfurters as long as they lasted? Or should he heave the offending hot dogs overboard and cut short his operations by a week? He decided, as any good military man would, to stuff his men and himself with frankfurters for a while. Being a smart captain who kept his crew briefed on the overall strategy of the war, Lowe got on the public announcement system and gravely explained the decision to all hands. He said, "Enemy flyers can't drive us home by the explosions of their powerful bombs. I'll be damned if I think we should be driven home early by the explosion of a case of our own canned goods." The crew all nodded reluctant agreement. Each man ate a couple of fathoms of hot dogs in the next week, and probably had a family spat next time a frankfurter appeared on his table at home. Perishable items like eggs had to be eaten up early in a cruise. The U-boats put to sea with the passageway through the boat cluttered with crates of fresh eggs. By the end of the first couple of weeks, the crew all had a belly full of eggs, and had eaten their way into a little more elbow room in the passageway. While the eggs lasted, the messenger on watch used to turn over each crate once a day, the crates all being marked with a circle on the side that should be up on even-numbered days, and an X on the side for odd days. I am told that this procedure postpones the day when the eggs begin tasting like mothballs. Whether it does or not, it adds an extra little chore to keep the boys busy when nothing much is happening during the first 10 days or so of a cruise. Lowe relates in a letter to me that when they shoved off on this Caribbean cruise, there was a shortage of coffee, so they were given a large supply of tea to make up for this. This led to an unforeseen burst of indignation from his crew, the first time tea was served. It seems that when a young sailor drew the assignment as cook on a U-boat, he was given a 10-day course ashore on how to keep hungry sailors well fed and happy. But you can't impart all the secrets of the culinary art to a willing amateur in 10 days, and evidently one secret overlooked at the school was how to make tea. Shortly after arrival in the Caribbean, Lowe's young cook dumped several pounds of tea in a big pot and boiled the hell out of it, the same as if it had been coffee. The indignant howls of protest from the crew when he took the first swig of this poisonous brew brought Lowe scrambling out of his cubbyhole to the mess room to stop a riot. Lowe said in his letter, "Since my mother was Dutch, I had learned how to make tea as a child and was able to correct my cook's education. I must have done it well because the crew seemed to like tea, prepared my way." I doubt if many readers have ever imagined that one of the duties of a U-boat skipper fighting the Battle of the Atlantic was to teach young sailors how to make tea. Lowe relates another little incident of this voyage. One day, while cruising on the surface, a messenger came scurrying down to his cabin with a request from the watch officer. Permission to change course and get some turtle steaks. He had sighted a school of huge sea turtles basking in the sun, and thought it would be easy to bag a couple of these proverbially slow leviathans. Lowe promptly granted permission and scrambled up on deck, followed by all hands, not on watch, to see the fun. The watch officer stationed a couple of men up in the bow with long-handled nets, slowed to a creeping speed, and conducted his approach on the school of turtles as carefully as if he were Preen making the firing run on the Royal Oak. But this naval engagement, like the Battle of Jutland, turned out to be indecisive. When the battle was over, U-505 retained control of the seas, as did the British after Jutland, but they got no turtles. Lowe's action report to me says, "Turtles are phlegmatic animals, which will let you get close to them, but become suspicious when you poke nets at them. We soon found the turtles could submerge just as well as we could. To help keep the boys amused, Lowe sometimes got up contests among the crew. They were simple affairs in which luck usually played at least a big part as skill, like guessing the number of dried peas in a 5-pound bag, or working a series of riddles, each of which had a dozen plausible answers, but only one of which had been pre-designated by the captain as the official run. They ran checker tournaments for the championship of the boat. Another contest was guessing the last 2 numbers that would appear on the revolution counter at the precise moment of noon. These contests aroused great interest because of the prize that Lowe put up, which caused each man to try as hard as if he were competing for an Olympic medal. The prize was that the skipper himself had to stand the winner's next watch. It isn't every skipper that could put up a prize of that kind. To do it, you've got to know just about all there is to be known about a submarine, because there's no telling whose watch you will have to stand. It may be the cook's, a lookout's, a throttleman's, a radioman's, or the watch officer's orderly. It's a good bet that when Lowe fell heir to a technician's watch, the man involved stayed close to the skipper while he was standing it. Not because he was afraid Lowe might goof, you understand, but because in case of an alarm, the monkey business would have to stop, and the skipper would be needed elsewhere. Even so, Lowe made character with his crew by showing them he could do the job of any man in the boat. After 23 days of futile prowling following the sinking of the McKean, a puzzling entry appears in the water diary of the U-505. July 22nd, 7:25 a.m. Sighted sailing ship bearing 30 degrees course west. 3-masted schooner, Romar, from Cartagena with Colombian flag. As he did not stop for my warning shot, I sank him with 22 rounds from my 10.5 centimeter gun, size 400 BRT. 9 a.m. She sank so far as the war diary is concerned. That's the end of the story. But this ending leaves a number of questions to be answered. In the first place, the shelling of this harmless little sailing ship seems completely out of character for Lowe. When he sank large steamers, he always waited, after his first torpedo hit, and gave the ship a chance to lower her boats before firing his second shot. In every case where the ship was unescorted and got off no SOS, he approached the lifeboats after the sinking to see if he could give them medical supplies, provisions, or advice on the course to nearest land. Why did he clobber this small schooner after one warning shot? Why is there no mention whatever in his log about the fate of the crew? And why didn't the schooner heave to after the first warning shot? It was impossible for her to outrun the U-boat. It was suicide for her to do anything but luff up and douse her sails. There is no logical explanation for what she did except panic. She had a native crew who knew nothing about the customs of war at sea among civilized nations, and they probably were paralyzed with fright, didn't know what to do, and so did nothing. Even so, it's difficult to see why Lowe lowered the boom on her with his second shot. If she had been a submarine trap, she wouldn't try to run away from him. The script for mystery ships called for them to stop, lower boats, and send off the panic party, leaving the ship ostensibly abandoned. The sinking of this 400-ton Spitkit, plying between 2 Caribbean ports, could obviously have no effect on the outcome of the Great Battle of the Atlantic. Why did Lowe waste 22 rounds of ammunition on her and risk disclosing his position, possibly bringing aircraft and destroyers down on his neck? There is a little use speculating and philosophizing about things like this 13 years after the event. It's just one of the messy little incidents of a global war which are important only to the men concerned in them. Looking back on it now, it is easy to say that this 400-ton schooner could have been spared from the grand total of over 20 million tons sunk, without affecting the final result. But the Germans can also point to some hospitals and churches we blew up in Dresden and say the same thing. Actually, I can't say that I blame Lowe for sinking her. She might have been a submarine trap. About a year later, when I commanded a Jeep carrier task group, I met several majestic old full-rigged sailing ships off the Azores. I had a sentimental attachment for these wonderful old ships that link present-day sailors to their adventurous ancestors. But I gave all these seagoing heirlooms a thorough casing, had my planes photograph them from all angles, and examine the photos with a magnifying glass, looking for suspicious radio antennas, oiling connections, or concealed hatches and side ports. I will admit, however, that while doing this, I felt just a little bit as if I were peeking under my grandmother's skirts, counting the ruffles on her pantaloons and accusing her of robbing poor boxes. But looking at it from Lowe's point of view, three-masted schooners that put to sea when a world war is in progress should have a skipper who isn't panicky, and should hire extra hands to be on deck at all times, ready to douse sail and heave to the instant a warning shot crosses their bows. If they don't, they can expect to get clobbered and to have the second shot explode in the middle of the crew's bunk room. Whether the U-505 was justified in sinking the schooner or not, the U-boat's luck changed from that day forward. Far be it from me to say that this was because she had sunk the Romar. But many superstitious sailors will shake their heads and say, it's bad luck to sink a sailing ship. Sailors are supposed to be notoriously superstitious, and to believe in all sorts of omens religiously. When you get down to brass tacks, these so-called superstitions are fundamentally religious in nature. They are an admission that man doesn't run this universe to suit himself, and that his plans are subject to a veto by a higher power. Sailors instinctively understand this and believe in God, because they have a better chance than men who stay ashore to observe and think about the handiwork of God. They see the daily miracles of sunrise and sunset, and understand the power that regulates them better than the scientists do. The scientists can explain the whole thing in terms of Newton's laws and show you that there is no miracle to it at all. The sun can't help rising and setting. But sailors who know nothing about Newton's laws are wiser than the scholars who expound laws which sailors can't understand. They go beyond the mathematics of the sunrise and see in it the hand of the one who created these laws of mathematics, as well as everything else. They rub elbows with God's power and majesty in the storms at sea. And when the ocean worships God by raising great sweeping mountains of water that dwarf in power with the majesty of anything we see ashore, they get drenched to the skin in worship. During the night watches, when the sky is clear, sailors gaze out into the depths of the starry universe in which we live. Each night they see how perfectly all parts of creation fit together. They see how harmoniously the whole magnificent machine operates everywhere except on this puny planet where man can interfere. Men who live close to these wonders every day on a tiny ship absorb and learn some things that smarter men may miss in the strife and turmoil of life ashore. They know instinctively that we in this universe were created by a supreme being, more powerful than the effect which he created, and not simply by the haphazard operation of the laws of probability. Sailors often speak of good luck, but when they do not mean gambler's luck, controlled by the laws of probability. When a sailor speaks of good luck, he means God's blessing, and there is certainly no better luck you can enjoy than that. Whether it is proper to say that the U-505 ever enjoyed good luck in this sense may be debatable. To get an impartial judge of this debate, you would have to reach far out into the starry night, beyond the limits of our solar system. But however that may be, the U-505 had nothing but bad luck after sinking the Romar. Her first bit of misfortune was that Lowe got sick and had to request permission to curtail his stay in the operational area. As a matter of fact, he had been sick for several days before the Romar sinking, and perhaps this explains it. U-Boat H crew granted permission to return and ordered a new skipper to relieve Lowe as soon as they arrived in Lorient. This was indeed a stroke of bad luck for the U-505. Low had been a good skipper. He was considerate of his men. He had confidence in them, and they trusted him. Until he sank the Romar, the U-505 had been quite successful, and success is one thing above all else that creates high morale in a happy ship. But now the U-505 would have to go through the ordeal of breaking in a new skipper, and only time would tell whether he brought good luck or bad luck aboard with him. On the way back to Lorient, the U-505 had a chance encounter with another U-boat bound for the Caribbean. On 20 August, they exchanged recognition signals with U-214, and since they were returning from patrol early and had extra supplies left, they took time out from their return voyage to go alongside U-214, and, as recorded in their war diary, to give their friends 2 cases of tea. Maybe Low's tea wasn't as popular with his crew as he now claims it was. On August 25, Low arrived back in Lorient, having been out for 79 days. This time, they had seen 6 targets and sunk 3, counting the Romar. They had seen 30 airplanes, but only 1 had seen them. Their cruising record was 12,842 miles on the surface and 498 submerged. The U-boats were still able to operate as surface vessels, but it is worthy of note that on her first cruise, the U-505 traveled 40 times as far on the surface as she did submerged. On her second, the surface travel fell to only 25 times as much. The comment of Dunnett's staff officers on this cruise was as follows: "Mission prematurely ended because of sickness of captain. Took advantage of few chances of attack during time of almost total traffic stoppage. The sinking of the Colombian schooner had better been left undone." 2 days after arrival in Lorient, Low had his appendix removed. He spent the rest of the war on shore duty with Admiral Dunnett's staff.